Hello, this is once again Luciano Joshua Gonzalez of the Benito Juarez Experience. In this episode, we are going to have a discussion that involves speculation and what sounds like conspiracy theory in relating to events that occur in Latin America when it comes to the Catholic Church and the governments of Central America. We are going to talk about the coup briefly. We are going to talk about Catholic leadership involved in the coup and the spiritualization of the government in its essence. If you enjoy this content, we hope that you share it, and we hope that you get other people engaged in a conversation about events that affect secular Latin Americans in and out of the United States. I hope you have a great day, and remember to share this podcast if you like it.
Another thing that I want to mention is that we talked in our previous episode about the religious left, and I've written more than a few articles about the Johnson Amendment. Some of them are very small. I'll be putting the link to my main article in the description to this, so that way people can read more about my opinion on this. But the idea that it's only Republicans who are going to get funding from this is not true. We talked in the previous episode about the religious left. There are some pastors who would undoubtedly donate and financially support the Democrats and progressives. And it's important that we not perpetuate a kind of stereotype about the state of churches. There are plenty of Christian progressive organizations, and not just Christian progressive organizations, because this doesn't just affect churches. This affects any place of worship which is considered a tax-exempt area. If the Johnson Amendment is lifted, it wouldn't just be churches that are donating money and that are giving financial support to politicians. There would undoubtedly be at least a couple of synagogues and mosques and other religious areas and nonprofits that would decide to get in on this action, for lack of a nicer way to word it. And I think that that's something that conservatives should think about, because if conservatives want to maintain their majority, which they undoubtedly do, understandably so, given the state of polarization in this country, then they should be thinking about how Democrats and the Christian left and progressives are going to react to all the things they do. If I were a politician and this got repealed, there is a part of me that would want to take advantage of it, and I think that's fair. I think that we're not thinking about this because there aren't that many resources that talk about evangelical factions that support progressive people in terms of politics and that give them space, aside from what we've talked about with the Christian left. And it's because they aren't very well known. I don't know of a whole lot of statistics that talk about religious members who are also progressive and Democrats, so we don't have any real numbers. We don't know how this could affect them, but if I were them and this happened, I would want to support. I would want to do it partially to lash out at conservatives who got rid of this and show them that they aren't the only people throwing money at their politicians, but also because it's an important way to balance, to level the playing field, so to speak.
So this is one of the reasons I wanted to do this show with you, mostly because I partially agree with you, but I don't totally agree with you. I do agree with you in the sense that, it's not just the religious right, which is active, that there's certainly a smaller politically active religious left. But I do think money-wise and in terms of how this would play out if it ever happened, the differential in terms of money and power would not even be comparable between what a very organized religious right and also the type of pastors that particularly evangelical pastors that kind of push for this are actually kind of like mega church, big, expensive kind of stuff, pastors. A lot of the people involved in the religious left, particularly in African American and Latino evangelical churches, are not necessarily, swimming in God's money. There's a lot of activism in terms of time that people provide, but not necessarily in time. There's probably not a lot of cash flow there, given the particular populations that they serve. And also, I think there's a big player in this, which I don't know which direction this would go, but the Catholic Church, which is the largest Christian denomination in this country, it's one that it's very divided. Something that I have talked at length and written at length before, in terms of, it's one institution. It's the Roman Catholic Church, but the political differences between their Latino and their white parishioners is actually it's heaven and earth, for using a nice religious analogy. That they're in very different places politically, but at the same time, what the growing Latino population in that church wants is very different from what the white elites in that particular church, in what the people who provide most of the contributions. And the American Catholic Church is actually probably the wealthiest in the world, and that provides a lot of funding for the church worldwide. Could do. It's I don't really know how they would play on these, especially because there's a lot of Democrats who are devout Catholics, who are also big part of church donors, like the Kennedys, for example. That you may have a really interesting sort of civil war dynamic going on in there, and I don't think they would be welcome something like that. So I think that to make my point shorter is that there's going to be a differential in power, and certainly I think conservatives will come ahead if this were, and this is why they are pushing it. I think that certain liberal religious groups may benefit, but they're not as big players as they could have been, like maybe 60 years ago. But also like how the money game, political money game, could end up being played by the largest political religious organization in this country. I don't think it's something that they may want to welcome, how they would get divided by that kind of political fight.
One of the interesting aspects of this that is extremely difficult to talk about without being largely speculation, and it's something that you mentioned, is the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is very divided, as you've mentioned, but one of the things that people don't seem to have considered in this, given that the Catholic Church is objectively the largest faction of Christians in the United States, is that the Vatican is a thing that exists. And the reason why I mention that is that this is a way, a very minor way, for a different government to talk about and very slightly influence how we talk about politics and how we think about politics. Because the Vatican is sort of its own country, and it's its own governing body. And obviously individual Catholic churches have not tremendous freedom, but they have a large amount of individual freedom, especially in the United States. they aren't close to the Holy See, but still, this is an interconnected group of individuals, and they're one of the only churches like this in the entire world among Christians that has a governing body in a different country or is arguably considered a multinational entity. So it's interesting to me to talk about that and to think about it. Unfortunately, we have no real way of knowing anything about that, so I'm not going to talk about it at length, but it is something that I want anyone who listens to this conversation to think about. I have to wonder what Catholic authorities would be thinking themselves if they heard that now, like not now obviously, but theoretically in the future where the Johnson Amendment is repealed, that churches can be used to give financial incentives to political candidates. I have no doubt that they would at least think about how that's going to affect how Catholic churches in the United States operate.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting, and right now, something that I mentioned at the beginning, that anecdote in which that thinly veiled swipe at John Kerry in 2004 in that particular church. John Kerry was a Catholic. Like he could have been the second Catholic president of the United States. Another JFK from Massachusetts, coincidentally. And there's major Catholic politicians in the Democratic Party. You have the Kennedys, who are like a Catholic dynasty. You have oh my gosh, I forgot his name, the senator from Pennsylvania, Casey, as examples of Catholic politicians that, and especially Casey, tries to balance that his life as a Catholic and also being a progressive, and try to straddling that pro-life minefield within the Democratic Party and the Catholic Church. You have Joe Biden, who was vice president for 8 years and in the Senate forever. So there are major figures and major important figures in the Democratic Party who are certainly very favorable to the church in most things, with the exception probably of abortion. And whether could the church become a player in trying to get rid of those few unfaithful Catholics who happen to be pro-choice, or at least Democrats hanging out with pro-choicers, in favor of evangelicals, even if they don't agree on much of anything. And how much abortion plays into all of these, because another issue of the Catholic Church is, or at least I growing up in Catholic schools, is this whole the culture of life is not just about abortion; it's also about the death penalty, and it's one of the probably the biggest organization against the death penalty, which is something that their evangelical cohorts in the right actually love very much. So I wonder, how these coalitions that probably, thanks to the Johnson Amendment, we can see a religious right that is actually more diverse in terms of their membership, because it includes right-wing Catholics and includes right-wing evangelicals and even right-wing Jews in some instances, could break up because of supporting or opposing candidates rather than being very transactional, working on particular issues, which is something they can do, and lobby for particular policies, and not necessarily having to get into electioneering per se.
So we can actually sort of guess what it would be like if the Catholic Church tried to get more interested in politics and specific politicians in the United States by looking at a, let's call it, case study that happened in Honduras. In Honduras in 2009, there was the coup. What a lot of people aren't aware of is that one of the influential players who never overtly took a side was Oscar Rodriguez Maradiga. I just butchered his last name. But he is a Honduran Catholic leader. And his whole thing was about abortion. He made statements in 2007 talking about how any politician who supported abortion could not be considered Catholic. It was a really, really big deal in 2007 if you were Catholic. And in 2009, the president refused to ban an abortion measure. He refused to, there was an anti-abortion measure, and he vetoed it. And this happened a couple of weeks before the coup. A lot of what follows is speculation, but it's speculation that Hondurans have talked and written about. It's said that because Oscar Rodriguez refused to side against the coup and support the president who he was once friends with, he was rewarded with an anti-abortion measure in 2012 in the Supreme Court. That is, of course, speculation, and it absolutely shouldn't be taken as gospel, but it is an interesting thing to consider if we start thinking about how the Catholic Church could play into politics. Of course, the idea that such a dramatic situation could happen in the United States, even with our current president, is virtually unthinkable for most people, but it still shows the role that religion can play in politics, because this person was an extremely influential Catholic leader. Honduras is over 50% Catholic, with a surprisingly large percentage of evangelicals, a few Muslims, a few atheists, and then some others. There actually are atheist groups in Honduras. They're surprisingly well organized. I like them. You can read about them. But it's good to know that we can look to other countries and we can see that at least specific Catholic priests are interested in politics. This doesn't mean we should think that the Catholic Church itself has any interest in foreign politics. As far as we can tell, it doesn't. But if we are knowledgeable of the world, we can find situations that reflect a variety of situations. And that's really neat to me.
Now that you mentioned, atheist groups, I also like to bring the attention of that something you said before, probably towards the beginning of the show, in terms of this sense of persecution that many, particularly white Christians, have. And it's certainly true. There's a lot of public opinion data, including some of that I worked myself back when I was at PRI, that shows that particularly white Christians of the evangelical bent think that white people and Christians are one of the most persecuted groups in the country. And how a lot of these may be, and it's probably driven also at a subconscious level or even at a conscious level, to the rise of people like us, right? The secular American boom that has been going on for 2 decades or so, that we have become more visible in American society, that it's become more acceptable to admit that either you don't care about religion or that you are an atheist. And that is something that, given to the little actual tangible political power that we hold, it's something that it's a huge threat in the paranoid Christian mind. And so when we think about these aspect of the Johnson Amendment and these moves to repeal the Johnson Amendment, we just can't think it just in terms of them, that these groups wanting it for politicking, but also what are the perceived enemies. And this is why it's imperative for people like us, and why it's very important to have Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the Freedom from Religion Foundation in particular, taking these fights, because one of the reasons churches, particularly conservative churches, want to get involved and want to do these type of active or direct political activism is to reverse the culture, right? That they've been losing the cultural wars for many years in different fronts, and believing God or the myth of the Christian America, it's actually dissolving in front of their faces, as more people without a religious affiliation and more people who openly disbelieve in God continue, admitting that they're openly secular, particularly among the young people like of your generation.
All right. So I love this chat. This is a topic that is extremely important to me, because even when I was a Christian, I understood the importance of the separation of church and state. So to see the separation of church and state and moves against it being so highly politicized and being used as a political weapon by any politician is frustrating for me. It's been good 30, almost 40 minutes. Now I think it'd be time for us to have some last thoughts on this topic, and I think that you should go first.
So you're going to have the last word. Good for you. I think of the many things we talk about today. One of the things that I always like to highlight is the fact that as much as America has a majority Christian population, and that many people claim to go to church and be devout, that there is a separationist streak in the American population, that this is that Americans don't want their churches to become an extension of Capitol Hill. That Americans dislike Washington for a reason, and that this movement could. Right now it hasn't gotten a lot of steam so far in this administration, partially because it is so incompetent that they may have no idea how to actually try to enact it into policy. But that it may well backfire, that there's going to be a lot of pushback on this, not just from general population. It's probably going to show up in public opinion polls, but probably within Congress, it's going to be something that is going to be really hard to move. So I actually, this is me hoping for the best, trying to be positive about the political thoughts of America, that actually in November disappointed me very, very, very much.
I think that's understandable. I'm not going to lie. I was a lot more worried about this particular issue before a couple of days ago. And the reason why my attitude is becoming cautiously optimistic isn't because of the state of Washington, but because of the fact that there's not just one poll which shows that Americans support, or estadounidenses, that people in the United States support the Johnson Amendment, and thus, at the very least, to the minimum amount, a separation of church and state, it's that there are other polls like this. People, at the very least, once you've explained what the Johnson Amendment does, people support it. And that's not going to stop Washington from thinking that this is what people in the United States want, and it's not going to stop politicians from thinking that by backing a repeal of the Johnson Amendment, they're going to trick people into thinking that they're doing real work which directly affects people's lives and makes it better, or somehow encourages people to vote for them. But it does make me a little bit less worried, especially because the Johnson Amendment isn't the Supreme Court. If the Johnson Amendment gets repealed and we get a new government, theoretically, we could put another Johnson Amendment back in, which is not a good attitude. I'm not optimistic. I don't think the Johnson Amendment would happen again if it got repealed ever. But I know that it's at least theoretically possible. This isn't a decision with permanent, life-changing ramifications, but it's still important because people value their churches, and people don't want them to be partisan playing things. And it's rare for me to agree with believers, but that's something that I can agree with. I think that their sacred spaces should remain sacred, and I'm glad that they think so too. This is the Benito Juarez Experience with Luciano Gonzalez and
Juhem Rivera.
And for now, we're going to say good night. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, let us know. Good night, everyone.
If you enjoy our podcast, feel free to like it, share it, and like our page on Facebook. We enjoy your support, and we appreciate that we're able to create content for you that informs you, entertains you, and hopefully makes you want to share it with other people. Thank you very much.